Hello again, women's writing students, and welcome to our week 3 lecture pod. We are still reading Maria Edgeworth's The Limerick Gloves, published in 1804, and the first lecture pod from week 2 took us through thinking a little bit about how marriage, or the marital union in that story, is a larger allegory or a larger representation or symbol of political union between England and Ireland in the early 19th century. And we looked at some of the anxieties that that story provokes when trying to map marital union onto political union, and we thought about some of the gender aspects of the story as well. So what are we going to look at this week? We're going to change the direction of our thinking a little bit, and we're going to think about class, and we're going to think about race, and we're going to think about how those two things intersect in the story and raise a number of questions, I think, again, about that union between England and Ireland. We're going to talk a little bit about cultural assimilation and look more closely at some of the national prejudice in the story, which we noted last week, but we didn't necessarily look into in some detail. And we're going to be thinking about this figure here that you'll see on the slide, the Fenian Guy Fawkes, the Irish Guy Fawkes, the Irish terrorist. And the word terrorist is used in the story. We'll talk a little bit more in class about the different connotations of that word compared to how we might use it today, although there are lots of disturbing similarities, I think. So we're going to think about this figure of the Irish terrorist and how it manifests in the story, and we're going to think about that in terms of race and in terms of class. So let's dive into our slides here and have a little look. So I wanted to start off by thinking about the intersections of class and race. And as I did last time, and I'll be doing this a lot throughout the unit, where I want us to be engaging with some of the secondary materials and the arguments that are made in those secondary materials, thinking about what some of those critics have said and engaging with those ideas in class. So I'm going to start off again from a reading that is on the view site under the Readings and Resources tab. And this one is by Julia Wright, and it's called From Terror to Terrorism, Gothic Movements in England. And she picks up nicely on these intersections between class and race. So it's a great way of kind of getting our heads around what some of the issues are in the text before we look at the text themselves. So let's have a little bit of a look at what Julia Wright says. And I've taken an extract here. It's quite a long extract, and I've broken it into 3 sections. I'm going to think about what she's saying in each section. This is a great way of modelling how you might do your own reading of secondary literature as well. So she says that The Limerick Gloves, Edgeworth's story, follows the unfounded fears of a plot to blow up a rural cathedral in England, and how this causes the gossipy linking of various minor crimes in the neighbourhood into a terrorist plot by an Irish glove maker recently arrived in the area. And vigilante action against the glove maker provokes vandalism by local Irish field workers of a sort not unusual in 18th century Irish agrarian unrest. So she begins by looking at what she calls the unfounded fears. And again, this is a sort of question that you might ask yourself. What are the unfounded fears in the story, particularly around race and national characteristics? And what Wright is pointing to here is how these unfounded fears grow bigger and bigger and bigger in the story, until some people in the story are really convinced that there is a terrorist plot to blow up the cathedral in Hereford by Brian O'Neill, the central Irish character in the story. But what Wright also does is link it to a certain type of unrest, a kind of civil disobedience in the 18th and the early 19th century. So she's suggesting that some of these unfounded fears are in the minds of these characters, because they are also things that they will have read about or seen or experienced firsthand in their own societies, that there is a level of kind of civil unrest which we see in the story, but which we can also see in the society. So she kind of draws out those 2 things. She makes the point that, as in so many of Edgeworth's tales, this action is classed. The artisanal classes, centrally the Irish glove maker O'Neill and the English tanner Hill, misunderstand each other because of national prejudice and cultural differences, particularly in the management of business affairs. The lower classes, including the English conman and the hot-headed Irish field workers, compound these activities through criminal activity. So she's linking here some of those unfounded fears, some of those fears about the Irish, and she links that to the class hierarchy in the story. And we might talk about this a little bit in class, where it's very obvious that there is sort of Mr. Marshall, who is the judge, and he sort of sits at the top of the classes, well educated, a professional man. He works as a judge in the local community. And it's really him that begins to dissipate some of these fears. He starts to look at how rational or irrational they are. And he starts to look into these stories circulating into the community, and he diffuses them by actually looking at the facts of the case. And then beneath him are the Hills, and the O'Neills as well, and they're the sort of what we might think of as the kind of middle classes, a level of professionalism, a step up from the working classes. And then we have Paddy McCormack, we have the field workers, we have the con man, and they very much are the labouring classes in the story. So there's a strict class hierarchy, we can see that, and we could actually map that out, and we might do that in our tutorials, just map out the class structure and see how that might compare actually to some of the class structures that we see in society today. But Julia Wright's point is that the racial thinking aligns itself with this class hierarchy. She sees how those two things are interlinked. She says that the moral lesson of the story, and remember we said that this story wasn't in the same way that many of Edgeworth's stories is educative, that there is a kind of moral, a very explicit moral in the story. Wright says that the moral lesson is pretty straightforward. Prejudice leads to paranoia. So the bad ideas, the negative prejudices that the people in Hereford hold about the Irish then lead to a certain kind of paranoia about an Irish man in their society, even though it's completely unfounded. And this eventually creates actual violence among the lower classes, while the calm light of reason among the upper echelons reveals much more ordinary crimes and so mollifies the terror. And so again, I think what she's beginning to point out there is that actually much of the violence in the story is located, and much of the criminal activity is located in the lower classes. And again, we might think about how there might be another prejudice at work in the story. This is a story that is looking at a certain level of national prejudice. It's looking at the awful ideas that English people have about the Irish, but at the same time, it exposes its own kind of class prejudices as well. Why is it, in many ways, that the criminal activities are located and the violence is all located within the working classes? And we kind of need this kind of upper class person to kind of sort everything out. There's a level of kind of sort of slightly patronizing tone to some of that. And again, we might want to think about that and think about how that's working its way into the story. It's also worth being mindful of what this negative thinking about the Irish is. Really talked last week about the history of colonisation of the English over the Irish. And you might want to have a look at some of these images on this slide. It gives you a flavour of some of the ways in which the Irish were depicted in the satirical comic press. And as you can see here, the images are not particularly edifying, they're not particularly pretty. We've got an Irish Frankenstein here, we've got a sort of buffoon, ape-like figure representing the Irish, we've got a devilfish, we've got a crying baby, a kind of child-like figure, we've got a vampire representing the Irish as well. So very negative images that dehumanize the Irish. In many ways, what these images were doing was they were justifying the colonisation of Ireland. These people are monsters and apes and devils, and they're like children, and they need somebody to come in and to civilise them in particular ways. So a lot of these images are actually propping up the colonial enterprise in Ireland, but they play a key role in that they dehumanise, in many ways, the Irish population. They fuel cultural prejudice, they fuel negative stereotypes about the Irish. So this is the kind of image of the Irish that we encounter in the story. You know, it goes very quickly from an Irishman moving into a local English town, and for everybody then to suddenly make him the centre of all the suspicions that are circulating around a variety of different things that have happened in the local community. Suddenly everyone's looking at him and thinking that he must be responsible for the hole in the cathedral. He must be responsible for the theft of Mr. Hill's dog. He must be responsible for the destruction of the oak bark rick. So unfounded fears lead to a certain level of paranoia. That paranoia then leads to a number of criminal actions and violence. Now, the story, we could argue that the story actually works quite hard to reorientate readers to the Irish, to reorientate their thinking. There is a sort of defensiveness in the story. At the end of the story, we realise that O'Neill is not responsible for any of these problems in the local community. We realise that there are some kind of lower class criminal activities going on that actually are responsible for this, but he is not responsible. So the story works very hard to perhaps represent the Irish to English readers. O'Neill is seen as a very sympathetic man, a very kind man, someone who's actually helping a local widow woman who is living a very impoverished life. So on that side, we can see the story as working in quite a positive way. And it's a story which tries to bring together the English and the Irish. It tries to move away from kind of violent interactions. But again, like when we were thinking about marriage and marital union and political union, I think there are a number of anxieties in the story itself that come to the surface when we read it very carefully. Because we could argue that the English and the Irish come together in the story at the end of the story because one, Mr. Hill, his prejudices have been diffused. He sees quite clearly that O'Neill was not responsible for any of this. He sees that his view of the Irish perhaps was not quite what it should have been, and that it was unfair. But he doesn't necessarily have to change his character or his person. There's not really any kind of reformation of his character. He's simply sort of been made to see that actually his ideas were a little bit foolish and that they were wrong-headed. In a number of ways. But there's something else that happens to O'Neill. O'Neill, it's not just his perspective has changed, but he's actually had to reform or change his character. And we could think about this in terms of cultural assimilation. That in some ways Brian O'Neill has had to assimilate to English culture. Mr. Hill has just had to change some of his ideas around Irish culture, but he doesn't have to become Irish. Whereas in some ways we almost feel that Mr. Hill has to kind of assimilate to English ways of doing and thinking and being. And a lot of this circulates around his business affairs. So in the story he gets unfairly arrested. But the narrator notes that the arrest actually had an excellent effect upon his mind, for he was a young man of good sense, and it made him resolve to retrench his expenses in time, to live more like a Glover and less like a gentleman, and to aim more at establishing credit and less at gaining popularity. And much of what this stems around is him looking at the world that he's living in and saying, well, I have to kind of assimilate to their ways of doing things. You know, I have to pay my expenses on time. It's not like it was in Ireland, you know, it's different here. And there is a kind of civilizing aspect going on, I think, with the Irish character O'Neill, which we don't necessarily see with Mr. Hill. So again, the levels, in order to make the union equal, in order to kind of, you know, bring the English and the Irish together, it seems like the Irish actually have to change or reform themselves in particular ways. They have to kind of civilize their business behaviours and bring it up to the standards of the English. And there seems to be a deep inequality in that kind of thinking. There's also something a little bit disturbing maybe, or again a kind of level of anxiety in the ways in which the prejudices within the story are kind of brushed to one side. Now the story is a kind of comic popular tale. It is supposed to be a little bit humorous, but let's just have a look at this extract towards the end of the story. And this is where Mr. Marshall, the judge, is kind of, you know, he's made Mr. Hill see that he was wrong in thinking that O'Neill was responsible for the criminal activity in the story. And now he's going to O'Neill to kind of make him kind of come together with Mr. Hill and explain everything. So no sooner had Mr. Marshall brought one of the parties to reason and good humour than he went to prepare the other for a reconciliation. O'Neill and his mother were both people of warm and forgiving tempers. The arrest was still fresh in their minds, but when Mr. Marshall represented to them in the whole affair and the churchwarden's prejudices in a humorous light, they joined in the good-natured laugh, and O'Neill declared that for his part he was ready to forgive and to forget everything if he could but see Miss Phoebe in the Limerick gloves. And so, again, there's something a little bit disturbing about that scenario in the ways in which it brushes off the prejudices that are felt in the English community. Oh, we're just going to kind of laugh them off. It was all a bit of a bad mistake, and we all kind of we've all kind of changed our minds now. No harm done. Well, a man was arrested and had to spend a night in a cell. He had to fork up quite a large sum of money in order to release himself from that cell. He's also now had to look at his own behaviour, and instead of thinking that maybe the way that he does business is actually okay and maybe the English should assimilate to that, he's decided that actually he has to assimilate to this more dominant culture. So there is a concern there that even within this union, it's not a particularly equal union. It still feels that the English are kind of sitting there as the colonisers and the civilised ones, and that the Irish kind of have to, humorously forget all the prejudice that has been thrown against them, and that O'Neill has to kind of forgive all this stuff about being arrested and the money that he's had to pay out. But the key thing there is that he has to assimilate to another culture. He has to give away some of his ways of doing things. And so again, there's a kind of inequality, I think, in that union. There's still a sense of the coloniser and the colonised, even though they have come together. So that's something I really want us to chat about. And let's think about what some of those anxieties are in the story in class. So I look forward to seeing what your thoughts are on this. Maybe it's just me that is looking at this in this particular way, and I'd love to see what you think about it too. So I'll see you in class very soon.